And I have an announcement. So, good news. I just accepted a Bio 50B section in the fall. And here's the section number. Oops, yes. Here's the section number. If you want to carry on in the fall with me, it's an evening class. So it's like a 5 to 6:15 lecture and then a 6:30 to like 9:30 lab. So it's kind of weird in terms of it being sort of a late night evening kind of a thing. But it's a thing. So I'm excited about that. And then the other announcement I wanted to make is that I am almost done regrading your guys' lab exams. I have like 7 left. So if you haven't seen your grade change as of like 15 minutes ago, I'm still working on that. And I will have those done after we finish up tonight. They took me a lot longer than I thought they would. And the lecture exams, I'm also going to probably be amending those as well in the upward direction strictly. So check back on your lab score to see your grade jump, and I'll get whoever hasn't seen their grade jump yet, I'll get yours in by tonight. And lecture exams will probably see a jump in like a couple of points at least for you guys as well when I get through with those, again, hopefully by tonight. And the deal with this week, the big plan here is that for today, I'm going to do a long lecture on bone tissue. So we're going to go into depth with some of the stuff that I kind of touched on when we talked about bone tissue in the histology section, but we're going to go into more depth this time on bone tissue today, and then the lab that is technically scheduled for today, which is
Hey Ashley, I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Since spring break got canceled, are we just gonna lecture right through, or how are you gonna work out the syllabus schedule?
Yeah, so what we've been told for spring break is that it's technically being rolled into the rest of the semester, so it's technically canceled. So some instructors might introduce new material, but we've been told that if we don't, that is perfectly fine, since most of us have, like I did, we already basically pushed to make up for the week that we already lost. So you guys basically, we suffered through last week in the exams so that we could kind of still have our spring break is kind of how it's worked out. So I'm going to have a quiz for that week on the axial skeleton, and that's on the syllabus. So it's normal. Basically, the only thing that's going to be different about spring break is that I'm not going to ignore you. I'm going to probably have office hours during our normal lecture time. So I'll just be on. I'll just have a Zoom thing going. And if you guys have questions on skeletal system in general, then I'll be here. But I'm not going to introduce any new material. I'm not going to lecture formally. There's not going to be any labs due for the week that was once spring break. The week previously known as spring break, which is the April 14th and April 16th for us.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, so for today, I'm going to talk about bone tissue. Since we did our lab 10 integument, which is scheduled for today, we did that way back. It feels like way back, doesn't it? Oh my God. Before the exam. I'm just going to lecture today, and we're not going to really do a lab unless you guys want to start on your next lab. But I'm not going to talk about the stuff in lab 11 until Thursday. On Thursday, I'm going to start on the actual bones and bone markings and stuff like that, which is what the lab 11 is actually on. So lab 11 on page 37 starts off with all the osteological terms for the different bone markings that we're doing. So we're going to start on that on Thursday. and work on that through spring break, supposedly, right? Yeah, so today we're just gonna do bone tissue. It's kind of a long lab. This is some of the more microscopic stuff for bone stuff. And then we're gonna start talking about the names of the bones and the different parts of the bones and stuff. So without further ado, if you have other questions.
Hello, Professor. How are you doing?
Oh my God, Joseph's here. How are you?
Yeah, good. I'm doing good. How are you doing?
It's like we've been disconnected for so long. It's really weird.
Yeah, you've been replying my messages, so that's
Yeah, I know,
fine.
right? Yeah, we're
Yeah,
only in contact through like Canvas announcements, which I
yeah,
hope you guys did see that, and I hope you guys have been attending SI session.
yeah. Some of them.
Okay, cool.
So that's good.
So SI sessions are still a thing, and you can still take advantage of those, and you should. And I have a chat for WhatsApp. Oh, aw, everybody's saying hello to Joseph.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, awesome.
Okay.
Well,
Go,
if
Bo.
there aren't any questions, I think I'll just dive right on in. Everybody can see my screen, okay? I'm assuming. Not like having any complaints. Everything's going smoothly. I shouldn't have said that. Knock on wood. Everything's going smoothly. Chapter 6, okay? So we wrapped up histology. We wrapped up the integument. We took our exams on it, and now we're going to start on bones, and we're going to start in sort of the histology sort of area of bones, so bone tissue. Whoops, and I got to click on it to make it go. All right, so before we get into the microscopic nitty-gritty stuff, actually, hang on one second. I'm going to go get something. I've got... Okay, never mind. Oh, wait. Sorry, I'm like running around here. I should have thought of this before. I have like an actual bone that I wanted to have for like my visual aid. Forgive me, I'll be right back. Sorry. Okay, I thought I had it like lying around. So I've got like my little, like all my curiosities in here in this room. And that includes some random bones that I have found because I like collecting weird things like that. We're gonna have access to this PowerPoint presentation on Canvas. Yep, we are recording as I speak. All right, so yeah, we're gonna record this. I'm gonna post it as a YouTube link as per usual on Canvas. I have a chicken bone here. This is the tibia of a rooster. You can tell by the this claw here that roosters have. So this is like his lower leg, and his toes would be here, right? And he's got this spur that he would use for fighting other roosters. I wanted to go get this because what we're going to talk about first is the structure of long bones, and the tibia is an example of a long bone. Long bones are bones that are longer than they are wide. And there are some terms for the different parts of long bones that we need to know before we get started talking about bones at all. The diaphysis of a long bone, of any long bone, is basically just the shaft or the long part of the long bone, okay? Long bones are hollow, and that hollow inner part of the long bone is called the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity is inside of the long bone. It's that hollow part of the shaft. And it normally contains yellow bone marrow, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the diaphysis is the shaft, and at the ends are the epiphyses. So you've got diaphysis, epiphysis, epiphysis, okay? So you have always a proximal epiphysis, one that's closer to the trunk of the body, and a distal epiphysis, the one that's farther away from the trunk, right? Okay. In between the diaphysis and either epiphysis, so in this region here and this region here, oh, rude, sorry, silencing now. We have the metaphysis, okay? So meta as in between, okay? Or medium, right? We've got this kind of a region, again, biology, there isn't like a clear demarcation, okay? It's just sort of like this region of any long bone between the epiphysis and the diaphysis is known as the metaphysis. And it contains what is called the epiphyseal growth plate, which is where bones grow from. So the bone, as bones grow in length, they grow from this part right here. So they get longer here, and they get longer here, and that's how bones get longer in general. So again, diaphysis, epiphysis, proximal epiphysis, distal epiphysis, and the metaphyses are somewhere in between. At the ends, on the ends of the epiphyses of long bones, you have what is called articular cartilage. And you could probably guess, and I hope you could guess, that the type of cartilage that is found at the epiphyses of long bones is hyaline cartilage, which is the most common type of cartilage in the body, right? This hyaline cartilage is known as articular cartilage at this particular location because because the ends of long bones are where you have articulations or joints, right? So you want to have that cartilage there to kind of cushion that joint and keep it going smoothly. We'll talk more about that in a bit. The periosteum is basically it's a membrane. It's made out of connective tissue, okay? So it's like a membrane or a sheath that covers the entire bone, okay? So all bones have this, not just long bones. Anything that is a bony surface is covered in a periosteum, a bony or a connective tissue sheath, okay? Everywhere except for where that articular cartilage is covering the epiphyses of the long bones is covered by periosteum. And then in that medullary cavity, that hollow center of long bones, there is an endosteum that lines the internal part of the medullary cavity as well. So let's look at a picture of this. Okay, so here's our long bone. We've got the epiphyses at either end, the diaphysis making the shaft down the middle, and this one is in a partial cross section, as you can see here, so that you can see the medullary cavity on the inside, and a little bit of yellow bone marrow even filling that medullary cavity. And if we zoom in to that right there, you can see the periosteum covering the outside of this long bone. And you cannot quite see the endosteum, but it is lining that inside of the medullary cavity, okay? At the ends, at the epiphyses of long bones, you do have spongy bone, which is this sort of like holy sort of Swiss cheese looking bone tissue in here. That is in contrast to the bone tissue that is forming kind of the hard outer shell of the bone, which is made out of compact bone tissue. Okay, so you have like a hard outer shell of compact bone tissue, and then you have spongy bone tissue in the epiphyses of long bones. Okay, so again, the diaphyses of long bones are hollow and full of yellow bone marrow. So they're kind of just like a tube of compact bone filled with yellow bone marrow. Okay, so far so good. Any questions about any of this?
No.
Okay, moving on. Oh, here's a nice picture of a cross-section of a real bone. This looks like a human humerus bone. So you can see the ball here, this proximal epiphysis of the humerus here. And you can see, I wanted you guys to see the spongy bone as it looks in real life, since we're not getting that activity in actual real lab. But this is what spongy bone looks like in real life. So it's got lots of holes in it. So it is kind of spongy. It is a little bit squishy in real life, not when it's all dried out like this guy, but it is squishy and vascularized. A lot of like red bone marrow going on in here. And then you can see the hard, compact bone outer shell of this long bone and how it's more hollow down when you get into the diaphysis of the long bone, right? Okay, so thought that was
a question.
Go for it. Yes.
So how do you know where there is red bone versus yellow bone?
Marrow, right?
Marrow.
You got two different types of marrow, red and yellow, and I'm gonna talk about them in a little bit. But speaking, the yellow bone marrow is only found in the medullary cavity of long bones. And red bone marrow is only found in the epiphyses, in where that spongy bone tissue is. Okay, so the red marrow is going to be in amongst this spongy bone tissue, which is at the ends or the epiphyses of long bones, and is also found inside of other types of bones like flat bones and short bones, irregular bones like vertebrae. So this is an irregular bone, and on the inside of this, instead of being hollow, it has just spongy bone tissue filled with red bone marrow inside of weirdly shaped bones like this. The yellow bone marrow is only found in the diaphysis, in the medullary cavity, in the diaphysis of long bones. Okay? Cool? Okay. All right. So these, I'm getting a notice that my internet connection is unstable. So if I cut out and if you miss a part, go ahead and interrupt me and ask me to repeat myself. I don't mind. No worries at all. The recording doesn't have a problem with it. It's just when you guys are watching live, I think. Okay, so speaking of, thank you. This is actually a really great segue into irregular, short, irregular, and flat bones, which include weird irregular things like your vertebrae, flat bones like the bones of your skull, right? Like the several different bones of your skull. Your scapulae are flat bones, and the short bones are kind of like, would be like the bones of like your wrist, the bones of your wrist. So a lot of the bones of your ankle and your foot are, they're not quite so much, they're kind of cube shaped, so they're not really much longer than they are wide. So they're not technically long bones, so we call them short bones. Irregular bones like your vertebrae, and flat bones like the bones of your skull and your scapulae, right? Your sternum is also a flat bone. Your pelvis, the bones of your pelvis, right? Flat. All right. So all of those types of bones, basically everything except for long bones, right? The bones of your limbs, the long bones of your limbs and your ribs, also have the periosteum covering, okay? So they also have that connective tissue membrane or sheath covering all of the bone except for where there is articular cartilage, if there is. They also have the endosteum, which is covering the spongy bone inside of these irregular, flat, and short bones, okay? So the inside of the irregular, flat, and short bones looks entirely like this. They're just full of spongy tissue, okay? They're not hollow. The only hollow ones are the long bones. So this spongy tissue has the endosteum lining like every little nook and cranny in there, okay, in the spongy bone. So that spongy bone is also called, I don't even know how to pronounce this, diploe, Joseph, do you know? Have you heard this term before? It was used multiple times in this PowerPoint, so I figured I'd leave it in there in case it would be found online or something. I'm gonna call it.
Oh, sorry. It's also called trabeculae.
Oh yeah, the trabeculae, yes.
Trabecular bone.
Trabeculae of the spongy bone I was about to get to, but this weird other alternate term for spongy bone, like a weird
Diplo. It's right. It's a right name.
diplo. Okay, cool. So we're gonna call it diplo. Is also is called diplo in flat bones. The compact bone is again forming a shell around the entirety of all of these bones. Okay. And this word trabeculae is just what we call all of this fine sort of like meshwork of spongy bone specifically, okay? So the endosteum of spongy bone is covering all of the trabeculae in the spongy bone, which again can be found in the epiphyses of long bones and in short, flat, and irregular bones, okay? Okay, so here's an example of a flat bone, the parietal bone of the skull with its compact bone shell, outer layer, and spongy bone on the inside. And if you zoom in, you can see the trabeculae really clearly in this image, right? So all of this weird like lattice work or mesh of the spongy bone are called the trabeculae. And the endosteum again is covering all of this structure. So it's still lining the inside of this bone, but it has to line like all these little structures. Okay, so here's my red marrow, yellow marrow slide. Make sure that we're all muted here since we're hearing each other. Don't want anybody to be distracted. Sorry, Joseph, I have to ask you to mute. Anybody else got theirs unmuted? Thank you. Okay. All right, so red marrow, yellow marrow. So the red marrow is only found in spongy bone, right? So it's in amongst the trabeculae of spongy bone, which again is found in the body of flat, short, and irregular bones, or in the epiphyses of long bones, so just at the ends, right? Red marrow is red because it is got a lot of blood flow, right? It's highly vascularized, and it's also the site of blood cell formation, hemapoiesis. So I know we talked about hematopoiesis. At some point, like I know that word came up at some point. I don't know if it was like the cells or histology or what, but I just want you to know that if you're thinking, what the heck is the difference between that and this? As far as this class goes, nothing. Consider them synonyms, okay? There's like fine, subtle differences, but hemapoiesis is the production of red and white blood cells and all of the fluid. The hematopoiesis is just like a technical term for just the cells themselves and not like the platelets and everything. So red marrow is where you have hemapoiesis, which is the production of all of your red and white blood cells and the platelets that are all part of your blood, okay? So that red marrow is where you have red and white blood cell production. And yellow marrow is only found in the medullary cavity in the diaphysis of long bones. And it is, of course, adipose, right? So it's fat tissue. And it is literally yellow in color because it is fat tissue. And since it is fat tissue, lipid, we are using it for long-term energy storage, right? Okay. All right, so the cartilages involved in the skeletal system include the hyaline cartilage, found at the ends of your long bones, the articular cartilage at the ends of your long bones, right? The ones that are involved in the joints that your long bones are involved in. The ones like here, and then the hinge joint that would be sort of like, I guess, I don't know, the elbow or the knee joint of a rooster. So we've got your hyaline cartilage. That cartilage is avascular, right? And it's not innervated. So you have no blood vessels or nerves. That's why when you mess up your joint and you mess up the cartilage in your joint, it's a big deal and probably only can be treated by surgery, because cartilage, hyaline cartilage, has no blood supply and therefore cannot heal, or at least cannot heal in any good, decent amount of time. It takes a long, long time for cartilage to heal. The other type of cartilage found in the skeletal system is, of course, fibrocartilage, which if you recall, is involved in shock absorption. So this is in like particular places where that is an issue, namely the intervertebral intervertebral discs. Saving and jumping back. Okay, so the cartilaginous disc that sits in between each and every one of your vertebrae in your spinal column is made of fibrocartilage, because it's a little bit denser and it's better at shock absorption. So when somebody like slips a disc, right, or they have a bulge in their disc, it's that fibrocartilage, which is that disc of fibrocartilage that is kind of slipped out from in between two vertebrae. It's also found in some of the cartilage of your knee. So when we talk about joints, we'll talk about the meniscus of the knee, which is a little cartilage pad. You actually have two of them in each of your knees that helps in shock absorption for when you jump up and down, right? And the last place is the pubic symphysis. So in the two halves of the, sorry, I'm gonna rearrange here a little bit. In the two halves of the pelvis, rearranging again. Okay, so we've got one pelvic bone, the other pelvic bone, and holding them together is the pubic symphysis, which is this little chunk of fibrocartilage right here. Okay, so you can see fibrocartilage here, which is forming the intervertebral discs, and fibrocartilage here forming the pubic symphysis. And I do believe I even have a picture of it coming up here. Let's see, dense connective tissue. Okay, so again, the periosteum around bones, and the perichondrium, which is basically just the same thing except it's around cartilage, is a connective tissue sheath that covers those structures, okay? Peri as in like outermost, okay? The perichondrium or the periosteum, right? Because osteo has to do with bones and chondrio or chondro has to do with cartilage, okay? And those connective tissue girdles or sheets do have a blood supply. So the only blood supply that cartilage really gets is from the perichondrium, covering the outside of it, right? But that doesn't penetrate very deeply into most of the cartilages. So again, most cartilage does not heal very quickly. Okay, so here's my pretty picture of our different cartilages. It also includes elastic cartilage, which is not really a skeletal system thing, right? But the elastic cartilage is your external ear and your epiglottis. But the ones that are involved in your skeletal system are the hyaline and the fibrocartilages. So your hyaline cartilage is all in blue here, again, covering the ends, the epiphyses of your long bones. It also is forming the cartilaginous joints that hold your ribs to your sternum. Also the cartilage of your nose, again, not really skeletal related, I guess technically, but and then your fibrocartilage, which is, as you can kind of see here, is your intervertebral discs, so in between each and every one of your vertebrae, and your pubic symphysis here. And then you got a little bit in the meniscus of the knee, the menisci of the knee. So we've got 1, 2 there, and 1, 2 there. And we'll talk more about those in particular when we talk about joints in a couple of weeks. So don't fret about that yet. The other thing that I might point out here is that the skeleton is divided up into the axial and the appendicular. So the axial skeleton forms like the axis of your body, right? So you've got your skull, your vertebral column, and your rib cage, your thorax, rib cage and sternum, forming the axial skeleton. And your appendicular skeleton includes the girdles, right? So you've got your pelvic girdle and your pectoral girdle that are holding the limb bones to the axial skeleton. Okay, so the appendicular skeleton is your limb bones and includes the girdles, the relative girdles that hold those limb bones to the axial skeleton, or to the trunk, I should say. We'll talk a lot more about that on Thursday. Moving on. Okay, finally getting into some microscopic stuff here. So let's talk about bone histology. Let me take a sip of tea. Okay, so bone cells, we kind of touched on when we talked about histology. You've got our osteocytes, right, which live inside of the little lacunae, which are the little bubbles inside of bone tissue, right? So we've got our little mature bone cells called osteocytes. There are 3 other types of bone cells that you need to know that are involved in bone tissue. The first are the osteogenic or osteoprogenitor cells. So a progenitor of anything is something that precedes or originates something, okay? So the osteogenic, or osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells of the bone that produce osteoblasts, okay? So you have bone stem cells called osteogenic cells that produce osteoblasts, and osteoblasts are bone cells that put down bone tissue, okay? They are bone tissue creators. They are laying it down, okay? Here's a sort of a picture, I guess, but more of a visual aid to help you to get these guys straight, okay? So you have osteogenic cells, stem cells that form osteoblasts, which are actually creating bone matrix and laying it down. That is how bone grows. The other 2 are osteocytes, which are the mature bone cells that live in the lacunae, and osteoclasts, okay? So osteoblasts put down bone tissue, and osteoclasts resorb or destroy bone tissue, okay? So they're constantly working, so I guess against each other technically, but they're kind of just working in concert, right? So osteoblasts lay bone tissue down, and osteoclasts pull bone tissue up. So osteoclasts break down the bone matrix. So here's your osteocyte, and here's your osteoclast. You don't have to worry about being able to identify these by sight, just know them by name and what they do, okay? So that's osteoprogenitors, are osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, okay?
Professor, and you said these are the ones that create bone marrow? Is that what you stated?
Bone tissue. So osteogenic cells create osteoblasts and all of the other bone cells, really. So osteogenic stem cells produce all of the other types of bone cells. And the other type of bone cells are osteoblasts, which lay down bone tissue. So the actual like calcium embedded matrix that is the hard stuff of bones. And osteoclasts reabsorb that hard, bony calcium tissue. And this is because we store calcium in our bones, right? So if we have not enough calcium for other things going on in our body, then the osteoclasts will be activated to pull calcium out of your bones. And if we have an excess of calcium in our body, then osteoblasts will be notified to start building bone tissue. And then, of course, if you have a bone injury of some sort, osteoblasts are again activated to repair that, to lay down bone tissue. Okay.
So you said the osteoblast basically regenerates bone tissue and grows bone tissue, and the osteoclast, I couldn't understand that part. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So the osteoblast, so bone tissue is it's inorganic, so it doesn't actually, it's not living. It's not really living tissue except for these cells. So these cells are really the only living part of bone. The rest of it, this matrix of bone, is made out of minerals, right? Calcium phosphate in particular. And that calcium phosphate, the hard stuff that makes our bones hard and solid, that matrix has to be built, and that is done by osteoblasts. And sometimes it needs to be broken down, and so that the calcium can be taken back to be used in other parts of the body. And that is done by osteoclasts. Does that clarify?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So one basically,
One
go ahead.
matrix and one breaks down matrix. Bone
Got
matrix.
it.
Yeah.
And then you said the osteoclast basically, you said it absorbs the calcium from the bones and it helps disperse it to other areas of the body.
I think it just passes it along to other things to disperse it. What it mainly does is it just breaks down the matrix to just so that those little building blocks that were the matrix can be used other places. So it mostly think of it as just sort of like a destructor. It just breaks down bone matrix. As far as transport goes, it's more detail than we need, really. Oh, let's see. We're going to have access to power. Yes, we're recording this being like, pregnancy in the fetus needs calcium. Absolutely. Yes. So during pregnancy, you will, I don't even know if I need to be writing this if you can hear me. I'm assuming that you can hear me, but that's okay. I'll write it anyway. Yep. During pregnancy, calcium is resorbed from mother's bones for the fetus. Yeah, so it's important for that reason, among many others, that pregnant people, they get all their proper nutrients and minerals, right? Because if you don't have enough calcium, then it's going to get it from somewhere, and it's going to get it from your bones, right? We're going to talk all about the types of reasons why osteoclasts might be activated to resorb bone tissue towards the end of the lecture. Oh, I keep doing that. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what that bone tissue, what that matrix actually looks like under a microscope. So what we're talking about here is specifically for compact bone, okay? So spongy bone does not look like this. What we're going to talk about now are structures that are specific to compact bone. So again, it's that hard outer shell that covers all of bones, right? Okay, all of our bones. The structures here, or these microscopic units that make up a bone, is known as the Humersian system, or as an osteon, or compact bone is made up of osteons, okay? Each osteon is a single structural unit of compact bone. We've got several different funny words that we get to memorize involving parts of the osteon, okay? The lamellae of an osteon are the concentric rings, kind of like the rings of a tree trunk of the osteon. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. I'm going to move to a picture here in a minute. So they are sort of like concentric tubes, okay? So like a column within a column within a column within a column, like the rings of a tree. So they are the structure that allows compact bone to bear weight, okay? So like from here to here, those lamellae of the osteons are able to allow that bone to bear a lot of weight. And then down the center, so like down the center of the tree trunk, in the middle of all of those concentric lamellae, is a hole. It's a tube, a hollow tube that goes down, which is called the central canal. And I shouldn't be pointing down the center of this bone, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. Down the center of this bone is the medullary cavity, and that's on a macroscopic level, right? So we're talking about something you can see with your eyes. What we're talking about here, in terms of a central canal, is microscopic. You can't see this with the naked eye, okay? This is an osteon. Let me take you to Wiley Plus for a second and show you that, really? Okay, fine. That this is also an osteon. This is an osteon. This is an osteon. Got one over here. So we've got all these osteons packed together to form compact bone, and these are the central canals. Okay, so we've got the central canals of all of these various osteons in this example of compact bone. So one of these right here, if you were to pull it out away from the rest of this, bone matrix, you would have a tube, right? And you've got concentric rings making that tube. So you can see the kind of the concentric rings of the tree trunk of this osteon here. So these are the lamellae forming these concentric rings around the central canal. And the central canal down the middle here is what contains the blood vessels and the nerves that feed your bones. So your bones, your bone tissue is technically vascular and innervated. Okay, so bone tissue has blood vessels, it has a blood supply, and it has a nerve supply as well. And that is due to these osteons. Don't worry about this twisting thing and the collagen fiber stuff. What we're going to be focusing on is these structures that you can see here, or that you can see. This is actually a better representation. So like this set of tubes, of concentric tubes within one another, is basically the same thing as this. Okay, so that's showing the same thing. So before I show you that other better picture, there are some other terms that you need to know. The perforating or Volkmann's canals are radiating out from the central canal. So here on a real example of bone tissue, these Volkmann's canals, is this actually something that I can click on to show you guys? Central osteon canal. Because it's not a specific thing. Out of curiosity, does Lee's have it? Let's see if Lee's has it. So skeletal tissue is connective tissue, right? Here's some crushed up bone. Let's see if we can find some. Look at those osteons. Look at all these osteons. So cool. Okay, so check out all these cool osteons in this crushed up bone tissue. And oh, we've got all kinds of stuff. So let's see about a central canal. Nice. And a perforating or a Volkmann's canal. Oh, look at that. Okay, so cool. So we've got a central canal of this osteon and a central canal of this osteon being connected by this perforating or Volkmann's canal. So it's basically moving at a right angle at a different plane. So the central canal is going this way and the Volkmann's canal is going this way, okay? To connect two different central canals of two different osteons. Okay, so that's a Volkmann's canal. The lacunae, which we've already talked about in histology, are the little hollow bubbles, if you will, in the osteons of the bone tissue where the osteocytes live. Okay, so the osteocytes are, again, the mature bone cells. And since bone tissue is solid, they need to have like a little hollowed out place to live. And that little hollow place is called a lacuna. And you can see that in both examples here. So the lacunae in our Wiley Plus example are kind of highlighted in red here, really hard to see. But each one of these little holes is a lacuna and houses a little osteocyte. Over here at Wiley's, over here at Lee's histology, there's a really nice example of a lacuna. So here's this osteon, it's kind of misshapen, squished in there kind of. But let's see how far we can zoom in here. Oh, that's about it. So each one of these is a lacuna, and each lacuna houses an osteocyte, okay? And the canaliculi, which is super fun to say, you should try it sometime, canaliculi.
I have a question.
Go for it. Sure.
Okay, so when I was trying to take the lab test, lamellae and lacuna, that something that are they different?
No,
Or-
lacuna is singular and lacunae is plural.
Oh my God, I was getting a headache just trying to figure.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Nope, they're not different things. They're the same thing, just singular and plural.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Yep. And so for lacunae, that have that as plural. I also have canaliculi as plural. The singular form of canaliculi is canaliculus. Which is
Lovely.
more fun to say. Yeah, right. I know. Wouldn't that be nice if it was just consistent? But of course, it's biology. It's not consistent. Some things are nicely consistent, but some things are just out there doing their own thing. So the canaliculi are they are also canals that are traveling horizontally instead of vertically. But what they're connecting is not central canals like the perforating canals. They are connecting lacunae. So again, we've got our central canal in the middle of an osteon, right? And our central canals are connected, not here, obviously you can't see it here. This, I guess just at this level is not a perforating canal, but somewhere down inside of this bone, there is a perforating or Volkmann's canal connecting these two central canals, therefore connecting the blood supplies, the blood and nerve supplies of these two osteons. We've got our little lacunae housing our osteocytes. And from each lacuna, you can kind of see, they kind of look like little spiders, each of these little lacunae. So each lacuna has sort of like little spider legs, and those little spider legs are the canaliculi. Here's the Lee histology, which I think is clearer. All of these little tiny canals that are connecting the lacunae are the canaliculi. So this is how the osteocytes can communicate with each other throughout the bone tissue, okay? So the central canal, so the central canal of the bone tissue so the osteon of the bone tissue has a central canal. The central canal has the blood and nerve supply. The blood and nerve supply is shared among osteons by these perforating canals, okay, which you can see on this level in some places. Ooh, like this is a good one right here. Look at that.
So, Professor, because of how many osteons you see, would you say that this is highly vascular, or is it just vascular?
That is a great question. I would just call it vascular at this point, because there are other tissue types that are much more highly vascular. So just know that bone tissue is vascular. It's vascular and it's innervated, which is weird and counterintuitive, right? Because like cartilage, like hard cartilage is not, but bone tissue, which is even harder, is. And the only reason that that's true is because bone tissue is made up of osteons, which have central canals, which allow for blood vessels and nerves to pass all throughout the bone tissue. Okay? And then they can share those blood and nerve supplies through the perforating canals. And each of these little lacunae and each of the little osteocytes inside of them can communicate with each other through the canaliculi. Okay? So you've got, one more time, central canals of various osteons, which are connected by perforating canals. And then within each osteon, you have the lamellae, which are the concentric rings of the tree trunk, okay? You can they're kind of hard to see unless you think of them as, the way that I learned it was that the lacunae are actually like little places where like the lamellae have separated. So the lacunae are actually like little they're actually along the lines of the concentric rings of the lamellae. Okay, so think of the lamellae as concentric rings, and the lacunae are kind of like little places where the rings have separated so that osteons can kind of like be wedged in there. They kind of like wedge themselves in between the layers of the lamellae. Okay, so lamellae of the rings, lacunae are the little houses for the osteocytes, and the canaliculi are little canals that let the osteocytes talk to each other, which is important because they need to tell each other, and they need to tell osteoblasts and osteoclasts what's going on in the bone tissue, and do we need to repair an injury, or do we need to pull some calcium out for something else in the body, et cetera, et cetera. More on that in a bit. Okay, so here's that pretty picture. We've got a long bone. We're looking at a little chunk of the compact bone outer shell of this long bone, okay? So this is the compact bone outer shell of the long bone. You can see a little bit of spongy bone lining the inside of that long bone, which is normal, as you can see by my picture, not this one here.
Question, Professor, I'm sorry.
Go for it.
Really quick, you said the compact bones are the only ones that have the spongy looking things at the end, right?
The spongy bone is in the ends of compact bones, right? But I'm not sighing because I'm exasperated. I was just thinking, sorry. I don't want to sound like I'm exasperated. I'm not. I'm totally,
That's okay.
Pretty cool to answer the question. Any questions at all? So spongy bone is found at the epiphyses of long bones, yes, like in this picture here. But spongy bone is also found on the inside of irregular, short, and flat bones as well. So these guys are full of spongy bone. In fact, I don't know if you can see it, but you can see a little bit of it where the compact bone outer layer has rubbed away, basically. After this animal died and the skeleton was sitting out in the sun, the compact bone sort of like degenerated, and you can see the spongy bone on the inside on some of the places where it's worn now. So this is basically, it's not hollow, it's just full of spongy bone. Whereas for long bones, you've got spongy bone at the ends, like you see here, and it's hollow in the diaphysis in the middle.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. So, and again, the osteon, this Haversian system, all of this lacunae, lamellae stuff, that is only in compact bone, okay? So that's only in the hard outer compact bone. This spongy bone, even the actual little bone parts of it, do not have osteons because they are so well supplied with blood at a close level that it doesn't need it, okay? This is just compact bone where you've got super, super dense bone matrix, so that you need to have like all this special system in order to feed it, basically, right? So the inside, the medullary cavity has a little bit of spongy bone lining it, but not much, and it also depends on your age too. So don't let this throw you off. There is a hollow shaft of the diaphysis of this long bone, okay? Concentrate on the compact bone forming the outer shell. That's what we're supposed to be looking at here, right? Here's our periosteum, the connective tissue lining covering the outside. And you can see the osteons running all the way down the length of the long bone. So the central canals are going all the way down along the long bone, parallel to the length of the bone, okay? The lamellae, the concentric rings of each osteon, are also, again, going all the way down the length of the bone, right? And if you were to pull one up and look at the concentric rings individually, you see that fit one inside the other. They're traveling down along the long end of the bone, which is why they allow for weight bearing, load bearing, right, for long bones. So they're the reason why long bones are able to hold weight. And then you can see the central canals of each of the osteons with their blood supply, nerve supply, and you can kind of see the little lacunae, which are, again, sort of embedded in between the layers of the lamellae. And each one of those has a little osteocyte living in it. And the canaliculi which you can see more clearly down here, are little canals that are connecting each of the lacunae, each little osteocyte and its little lacuna. Here's a really, really neat, super high quality zoomed in microscopic image of an osteon with its little lacunae and its central canal. And here's a slightly more zoomed out image, like the one we have from Dr. Lee's and Wiley Plus, of a osteon with its central canal, its lacunae, in the lamellae, right? And little osteocytes are living inside of each one of those. Okay, so that's the bulk of the weird words for microscopic bone tissue. Any questions at this point?
I have a question. On page 187 in our book, it shows the lacunae, like the outer line of it.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make sure because I don't want to.
Oh, okay, let's look at this. Okay, the lacunae. Okay.
So it shows us like it's like the outer line.
DJ, what
It does, so it is, so it does have. Okay, so there is a little bit of an osteon structure in spongy bone. I misspoke. I'm sorry. So the it's just not as there is no central canal.
187 in our book.
187, thank you.
Yeah, so on page 187, we've got we've got a similar image to what we're looking at here on the PowerPoint. What she's talking about is, I believe, so this is a cross-section of part of the trabeculae of the spongy bone here, right? And there is a little bit of a sort of an osteon sort of thing going on here. What it's lacking compared to compact bone tissue is the central canal. So the whole point of the central canal in compact bone is to allow for vascularization of compact bone tissue, which otherwise has no blood supply. So the trabeculae of spongy bone tissue do have osteocytes, and they do have to live in lacunae, and there is technically lamellae for those lacunae to like be wedged into, but there's no central canal in the spongy bone part. Okay, that's just a compact bone thing. So when I say there's no osteons in spongy bone, that was a misnomer. There's no central canal in spongy bone. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. That's good. Excellent. Okay.
Hey.
Action unstable. Tell me to repeat if I need to. Oh, hey, look at that. We zoomed in even more. Okay, so that's just a zoom in of this in case you wanted that. I don't know. All right. So excellent segue. The trabeculae. So those things that we were just talking about, all that lattice stuff of the spongy bone tissue. Those trabeculae, which is basically just all of this weird structure inside a spongy bone, they actually align along lines of stress in the bone, which is pretty cool. So anywhere where you're going to have impaction onto a place where there is spongy bone, those trabeculae are going to be aligned in such a way that they will actually support the bone and not allow it to crush. So this, according to your text, according to page 187 of your text, is incorrect. So let's know. So we have osteons present, no central canal here. I'll have to re-upload. Let me write myself a note to re-upload this PowerPoint so that you guys have the accurate version. Oh, I lost my notebook. I need a pen. Okay. Upload chapter 6 PowerPoint. Okay, make sure that I do that. Oh. I'm getting texts from my friends. We're talking about how Governor Newsom looks like Matthew McConaughey. Are we the only ones that noticed that? He's got kind of a Matthew McConaughey thing going on. Anyway, the trabeculae do contain, so I guess osteon, I don't know how I feel about this now, because it says osteons in compact bone and trabeculae in spongy bone. So does that mean that there's osteons in compact bone and the trabeculae of spongy bone? Or there's osteons in compact bone and then there's trabeculae in spongy bone? I'll have to look that up and clarify that. Osteon question, the big osteon question. I'll have to clarify that. This PowerPoint was actually, it was given to me by, oh God, I don't know her last name, Campos, Peggy Campos, who teaches this class and has been teaching it for a lot longer than I have. And this was what she had written. So it said no osteons. But I'm going to trust her at this point. No osteons proper. Not like, they're not osteons like in compact bone. There's no central canal of these, but they do have some other aspects of osteons, which include irregularly arranged lamellae. So you can see it still has layers. You still have lamellae. You have osteocytes living in lacunae, and you have canaliculi connecting the osteocytes, connecting each lacuna to each other. And also capillaries, which are going to be part of the endosteum. So the endosteum, again, is lining all of the trabeculae of the spongy bone tissue. There are blood vessels in that connective tissue of the endosteum, okay? That is how these osteocytes are being fed. That's how they are able to stay alive without a central canal, right? Okay. Trabeculae. All right. We've got different, okay. So the chemical composition of bone. Your book doesn't really go into this. I just want to mention it. What's really important for you guys to know here is that bone has an inorganic and an organic component. The organic component of bone is basically bone cells, okay? So there is some like extracellular matrix that has like a carbon base, which makes it technically organic. So you've got some things that are in other types of connective tissue, like the proteoglycans, so that's like proteins with carbohydrates. Again, glycoproteins, same thing, other way around. And collagen fibers, right? So this is connective tissue. There are some collagen fibers present to give bone some flexibility, right? So there are some other organic bits to the bone matrix, but the bulk of the organic part of bones is the cells, okay? So your osteocytes, your osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and your osteogenic cells, the 4 types, right? The inorganic, right, the non-carbon-based portion of bone is the mineral part, right, which is a lot of the bone. So like literally 65% apparently of the bone, right, by mass is inorganic. And it is mostly calcium phosphate crystals, okay? So the calcium is really the major player here. We know that our bones are made of calcium. We know that we need to get enough calcium to have strong bones and teeth, right? But calcium is also, it's very hard mineral, right? It's like a rock, so it allows resistance to compression. But calcium has other purposes in the body, so it's not just to keep your bones hard. It's also to send and receive signals from cell to cell. So it's part of like the electrochemical signaling process. It's part of maintaining and changing the electrical gradient between the inside and outside of cells, right? So we talked about like keeping a certain number of ions, positive and negative, in between or on other sides of the plasma membrane of cells, right? And being able to control that gradient gives cells the ability to move other things in and out of the cells, and also allows them to send a signal or an action potential down along and between different cells. So calcium is uber important, and if you don't have enough of it to do things like contract your muscles, then you're going to start pulling it out of your bones. So it's important to get enough calcium. End of public service announcement. Moving on. So all I want you to know from that is that there's an organic part, which is your cells, the bone cells, and there's an inorganic part, which is basically calcium. Okay.
Question.
Go for it.
On that same page of the 187, can you go back like 2 slides? I could show you right here. Go back. No.
Yep.
On the osteoclast. Okay, right there. So so in that picture, it says osteocyte, osteoclast, and then osteoblast.
In this picture?
No, on 187. Yeah. On where it says lacuna.
Oh, over here?
Yes.
Here? Yeah, so you've got osteocytes living in the lacunae. The osteoclasts and osteoblasts are going to be, I don't know if they're on the inside or the outside of the periosteum. It's not important for you guys to know that at this point. Just know that they're around, and that the osteoblasts are going to be depositing that bone matrix, the inorganic part, right? As well as some of the organic parts like the collagen fibers and stuff, that bony matrix. And the osteoclasts are going to be breaking down the bony matrix as needed. Can you see this? Am I like holding this in the right place?
Yeah.
The osteoclasts are breaking down, and the osteoblasts would be building it back up. And they're both constantly working. It's just a matter of which one's outdoing the other at any point, right? In terms of like whether your bone is being, whether the net result is bone being broken down or bone being built.
Okay.
So they're all constantly working. I think I have, and I do, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what causes each one to be activated a little bit here. How are we doing? Okay, so we're in about an hour. Woo! Okay. Still with me? Here we go. So we've got, we do have to talk about how specifically blood and nerves go into the bone. So this picture is actually almost identical to the one on page 188 of your textbook. So you can see the epiphysis, right, the end of this long bone, the metaphysis in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and the diaphysis of the long bone, right? You can see that it's hollow. We've got a little periosteum covering here. And then we can see that there are certain bundles, certain places where blood vessels actually go into the bone. So you have blood vessels that invade the bone. And so they would be traveling through, probably looks like the Volkmann's Canal. Actually, this is probably going to be an actual foramen. Okay, so if you look at this picture, okay, this is non-microscopic, right? We can see this with our human eye, okay? The compact bone at the edges is the part that has the osteons, right? And the osteons are traveling up and down this, right? So they're, the length of each osteon is parallel to the length of the bone. Does that make sense? So the osteons are traveling parallel to the bone here. There are lots and lots of little, you've got your central canals, and you've got your Volkmann's canals, your perforating canals in between the central canals that are carrying blood vessels, but they're very, very small, like capillary sized blood vessels there. What we're looking at here in terms of the blood vessels invading the actual bone all the way to the inside, the way that they're going to get in here is through actual like holes in your bone, so like foramen. And you can actually see like this might actually be for a nerve or a tendon. But if you look at a bone, any bone closely enough, you can see that it has little holes And the little holes in bone are called foramina or foramen, a singular foramen, plural foramina. So here's a foramen, you can see there. You can see a little foramen on this side. You've got several foramina on the back side of this bone. I should say the front side of this bone. Those foramina are going to be holes in the bone where blood vessels can actually get inside to the spongy bone on the inside. You've got one, you got at least one, you don't have to worry about how many you've got, but you've got ones in the epiphysis that, excuse me, allow in the epiphyseal artery and the epiphyseal vein. Forgive me, I'm just gonna be really anal here for a second. Okay. You also have ones that go into the bone at the metaphysis. They are called the metaphyseal artery and the metaphyseal vein, conveniently. You also have ones that, well, you don't really have any major ones that go in through the diaphysis. Instead, you have ones that are involved with the periosteum, which is covering the outside of the bone, right? Connective tissue covering the outside of the bone. And they are called the periosteal artery and the periosteal vein. This was literally, this is just saying, oh, I could have written it in, but I got lazy apparently. This is the medullary cavity is what that's pointing to. And this is compact bone is what that's pointing to. Okay, so don't worry about, you're not missing out really on anything you haven't already seen here. And then, oops, finally, this ginormous foramen here called the nutrient foramen, and this actually appears to be a human tibia, so this should actually be homologous to this guy here. Wonder if I can see the nutrient foramen on this guy.
Homologous, huh?
Yeah, it's homologous. It's an evolutionary term. It's homologous. They all evolved from the same thing, right? So chickens and humans all evolved from the same way back when, and we all had, you know, we all had the kinds of bones that we had, and there's no reason for us to have like differences in the way that our bones work. It's just would be silly to evolve two different ways for bones to work, right? So all of our bones work the same way. And so we probably have a homologous opening or foramen in this rooster's tibia that we would have in this human tibia. And I don't know what it is, but it might be that. It could be that little hole right there. But anyway, you've got a nutrient foramen, which is a literal hole in your bone. It's a type of bone marking, which is what we're going to talk about on Thursday. And through that nutrient foramen, you have the nutrient vein and the nutrient artery that go into the medullary cavity of the bone, and then vascularize all the rest of the compact bone, right? And then the spongy bone as well. Any questions about that? These are just the ones that you need to know. Epiphyseal artery and vein, metaphyseal artery and vein. You don't need to know which is which. Arteries are generally red, veins are generally blue, to indicate high oxygen blood supply and low oxygen blood supply leaving. Metaphyseal artery and vein at the metaphysis of the bone. And then periosteal artery and vein is associated with the periosteum. And the nutrient foramen, the nutrient vein, and nutrient artery are going to be part of this great big hole in the diaphysis here. Okay. All right, so that's it for the blood supply, blood and nerve supply of bone. I guess we don't really talk about nerve supply so much, but that's okay. That's what you need to know for that. Okay, any questions before I get into bone development? We're gonna embark, this is embarking on another level here, so questions if you got them. We're actually doing really good here. This is good. Once we get through development, we can talk about injuries, and that's always fun. We love talking about injuries, right? Injuries.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Just want to confirm the organic ones that you said that we need to know for the chemical composition of the bone are the osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts, right? Those are the only ones that we need to kind of
That's all you
memorize.
really
Okay.
yeah, so you need to know the 4 different cells of bone, and then just know that those 4 cells really make up the organic part of bone. And that's really it.
And then you said the inorganic, only thing we need to know is just calcium.
Yeah,
Right.
it's inorganic, it's calcium, it's mineral,
Okay.
but calcium specifically.
Perfect. Okay. I just wanted to clarify. I didn't miss anything. Thank you.
No problem at all. No problem at all. All right, so let's talk about bone development. It starts in your book on 189, page 189. I'm not going to go into as much detail as your book has. So if you have a burning desire to understand the minutia of this, your textbook is a good place to start. But here's what I'm asking you to know. Osteogenesis, genesis as in like the beginning, right? So we're creating bone, right? So osteogenesis. Ossification is also like the making of bone. Osteogenesis is really like literally like in the beginning. Ossification happens whenever you are putting bone tissue down. Okay, so they're kind of interchangeable for the sake of this class. Bone tissue formation, creating bone tissue. You're either creating it for the first time ever or not, okay? So there are 3 main stages of all bone development. We've got the actual first time ever osteogenesis, bone formation, okay? In the 2nd month of fetal development. So we're talking about like 8 or 9 weeks, okay? After birth, okay, so postnatally, you've got lots and lots of bone growth until early adulthood. So obviously you're growing bigger and taller, so your bones are growing bigger and longer. And they do so until like you're 25 sometimes. So big chunk of your life, you're growing bone. And then all of that time and from 25 on out, you are doing bone remodeling and repair. The remodeling is what I was talking about in terms of the balance between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, right? So the osteoblasts putting bone tissue down and the osteoclasts dissolving and destroying bone tissue for that calcium. The balance between those two, whether you're building more than you're destroying, or you're destroying more than you're building, is called bone remodeling. Okay, you're basically changing the bone one way or another. And then, of course, repair in the case of injury, right? You're going to want to put down bone tissue to repair breaks and stuff.
So, Professor, as you get older, those 2 checks and balances that you were basically referencing, the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, do those just slow down, or one eventually outbalances the other? Is that what happens?
Exactly. That's exactly what happens. Yeah. So you have, and we'll talk about this, but there are hormonal reasons for each osteoblast and osteoclast to be activated. And because of hormonal changes as you get older, the osteoblasts don't get activated as much and the osteoclasts do. So it's super common as you get older for your osteoclasts to be outpacing your osteoblasts. And so they're destroying more than you're building.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We're going to talk about that more in a bit. Okay, so we have, so again, ossification, osteogenesis. Osteogenesis is really like first ever bone formation of a fetus. And ossification is kind of like throughout your life, okay? So throughout your life, bone formation, we have a couple of different kinds. Who is this? What's this? I got chat. What's that? Uh-oh. You guys having technical difficulties? Anybody else having technical difficulties? Screen flashing kind of stuff? Mine looks okay, but I think that might just be because I'm the host. Okay, well, I hope it sorts itself.
What page are you in, Ashley?
What
page are you in?
Oh, we're on page 189. 2 types of ossification: initial bone formation in the embryo and fetus for your viewing pleasure. Here we go. For your learning pleasure. All right, so we've got two types of ossification. Intramembranous ossification is when bone develops straight from basically that, oh, I forgot what it's called. The mesenchyme. Okay, so from, I didn't ask you to memorize to learn the mesenchyme when we talked about histology, but it's basically embryonic connective tissue. Okay, so that the first, remember when we talked about development, we talked about I'm starting to lose it now. The outer layer that ends up forming the epithelium, the inner layer that ends up forming the gut, and the layer in the middle that ends up forming everything else, your muscle and bone and stuff. So that muscle and bone layer ends up becoming mesenchyme, like the next level of differentiation of those cells is mesenchyme, which is basically like stem cells for all types of connective tissue. So that mesenchyme is going to end up forming, some of it's going to form your cartilage, some of it's going to form your blood, some of it's going to form connective tissue proper, and some of it's going to form bone. So that mesenchyme can go straight to bone, which it does sometimes. And that type of ossification is called intramembranous ossification. So you're going straight from bone, straight to bone from a fibrous membrane of mesenchyme. This type of ossification is how flat bones are formed. So the bones like your clavicles, your shoulder blades, and the bones of your skull are formed by intramembranous ossification. Why? I don't know, and I don't think anybody else does. So they both of these types of ossification result in bone. They result in the same thing. They're just two different ways of doing it. And for some reason, your flat bones do it this way with intramembranous ossification. The rest of your bones, your normal bones, if you don't mind me saying so, form by endochondral ossification, which basically is just that they, instead of going straight from mesenchyme to bone, they go from mesenchyme to cartilage to bone. So it's like a second step in there, okay? So the mesenchyme becomes cartilage first, and then the bone replaces the cartilage. So what happens there is that you've got the cartilage forming kind of like a mold for where the bone is gonna go, and then the bone just kind of replaces it, and everything that was cartilage becomes bone. And so that's endochondral ossification, okay? So in cartilage ossification, bone making. Okay, so let's talk about intramembranous ossification first in a little bit more detail. So here's the mesenchyme in blue here. A couple more chats, make sure it's not something I'm missing out on. Okay, so you got the mesenchyme in blue, and then you've got our little osteoblasts, right? If you have a photographic vision, maybe you recognize these from our bones, our four different types of bone cells. So we've got our osteoblasts, right, which are the bone cells that lay down bone tissue, bone matrix. They generate here at the Ossification Center. Okay, so the Ossification Center is basically like the starting place for ossifying or creating bone tissue. Okay, so you need osteoblasts at the Ossification Center to start laying down bone tissue, and that's how you're going to start to create a bone amongst all of this mesenchyme. Okay, so the Ossification Center appears, don't worry about the details of that, it appears in the fibrous connective tissue membrane. Oh, it tells you right here. So there are certain selected mesenchymal cells that cluster and then differentiate specifically into osteoblasts. So there you go. Something tells a certain little group of mesenchymal cells to cluster together and then to differentiate into osteoblasts. And there you go, forming an ossification center. Could have read my own slide before showing it to you. Sorry about that. All right, so the ossification center grows as those osteoblasts put down bone matrix, right? So here's that newly calcified bone matrix that all of these little osteoblasts are actively putting down in the ossification center, right? So as they're doing that, as they're putting down this matrix, also known as the osteoid, but I haven't used that term yet. It's a thing. I'm using bone matrix with calcium, right? This inorganic part of bone is being laid down by the osteoblasts. You're also forming our little lacunae, right? With our osteocytes living in there. So we're building compact bone here. So the osteoblasts are secreting bone matrix, also known as the osteoid, and it calcifies after a few days. And it's actually trapped. I'm learning things as we go too, I guess. As the osteoblasts get trapped on the inside, they then differentiate into osteocytes, into mature bone cells. How cool is that? That's really cool. Okay, moving on. Okay, so now we have some real bone tissue amongst the mesenchyme, right? They're starting to be vascularized. So the mesenchyme starts to condense and come together towards the bone to form the periosteum, the mesenchyme all around this bone. Again, we're just talking about intramembranous ossification, right? So we're talking about flat bones, we're talking about your clavicles and the bones of your skull. So you've got our bone, we've got the periosteum starting to form from the surrounding mesenchyme that surrounds what was once that ossification center, right, where the bone grew from. We've got ossification happening, and it's working around the blood vessels, the embryonic blood vessels there. Okay, woven bone. I'm not worried about you knowing that. Okay, so basically we've got all you need to know for this step is that the periosteum is forming. Okay, don't worry about woven bone. We're talking about the periosteum forming. So the bone is being formed around blood vessels that were already there, and the mesenchyme is condensing to form the periosteum around the outside of this bone. And finally, I believe, yeah, looks like it. We have okay, so woven bone is basically like a stepping stone, it looks like, between a real adult bone and the mesenchyme. So you have the woven bone now being replaced by actual compact bone, which has the lamellae, right? The concentric rings of the osteons, right? So this is happening just deep to the periosteum, naturally, right? Because this is where all of your little osteoblasts are, and they're busily putting down bone matrix on the edges, right? So they just keep building the bone out, and that's becoming calcified, and then it's becoming woven bone, and then it's becoming compact bone with lamellae. These trabeculae that were on the most internal part of the bone, which is true of any type of flat bone, right? We know this to be true. It's got compact bone on the inside with a shell, or sorry, it's got spongy bone on the inside with a shell of compact bone on the outside. Those trabeculae are getting thicker and being replaced by compact bone towards the edges. Some will, of course, remain in the middle because, again, flat bones have spongy bone in the middle. Spongy bone, internally vascular tissue becomes red marrow, right? So we know that spongy bone on the inside of flat bones and irregular and short bones and the epiphyses of long bones is going to be full of red bone marrow eventually, okay? Red marrow is in spongy bone, okay? Okay, that is recapped pretty well on page 190 of your textbook, okay? And that is intramembranous ossification, okay? So that happens for the first time in like 9-week-old embryos in flat bones like your clavicles and your skull bones, the bones of your skull. The second type of ossification, endochondral ossification, which again is going from mesenchyme to cartilage, then to bone, happens in all the rest of your skeleton, okay? So all of your long bones, your irregular bones, and your short bones, everything except for flat bones, forms by endochondral ossification. So we're basically building a mold or a model of hyaline cartilage first, building a little cartilage bone, and then replacing all the cartilage with bone tissue. Okay, so obviously you have to break down the hyaline cartilage in order to replace it with bone tissue. Here it is in a nutshell. This is what's important here. 1, it starts out as hyaline cartilage, okay? 2, you have a primary ossification center. So instead of just having one ossification center, like you do in intramembranous ossification, you have a primary ossification center happening in this, what is going to be a long bone, happening in the diaphysis, in the middle of this long bone, right? So again, it's cartilage. That cartilage gets broken down and ossification begins at the primary ossification center in the middle of the diaphysis of this long bone, okay? That ossification continues, right? It turns into spongy bone first, turns into, and then some of that spongy bone, namely the spongy bone on the outside, becomes compact bone, right? So that's similar to the intramembranous ossification. Spongy bone turns into compact bone where it needs to be and stays spongy bone wherever it needs to be. And then you have a secondary ossification center happening in the epiphyses of the long bone, okay? So the primary ossification center was in the middle of the diaphysis of the long bone. And then after it gets to a certain point, you have a secondary ossification center that emerges at the epiphyses of the long bone. When the secondary ossification centers are done ossifying the cartilage in the epiphyses, you end up with articular cartilage, some hyaline cartilage left over to form the articular cartilage at the ends, at the capping the epiphyses of the long bone, right? At the articular points of the long bone. And you still have a little bit of hyaline cartilage in between the epiphyses and the diaphysis. And that's at both ends, right? So you've got this little line of cartilage still. And what that is called is the epiphyseal plate, okay? The epiphyseal plate is going to then become the growth center for your long bones to get longer, okay? So this part doesn't get any more bone growth happening here. You're gonna have bone remodeling and stuff happening, right? To replace whatever compact bone here in case of injury or whatever. But this long bone gets longer by turning this cartilage into bone at either side of the plate, okay? So you're depositing bone here and you're depositing bone here, and that's how the bone gets longer from this point, oh God, sorry, from this point and from this point. So it gets longer at the epiphyseal plates at either ends of the long bone, okay? Each step, not worried about the details so much of it, just that it starts out as cartilage, okay? So this is that 2-month mark, that's week 9. So it starts out as a cartilage model, it's hyaline cartilage. You have a primary ossification center that forms, and the cartilage is broken down at that primary ossification center, which is at the center of the diaphysis of this long bone. We've got that ossification leading to spongy bone, at the primary ossification center, forming the hollow medullary cavity, right? We're forming the diaphysis of the long bone. That some of that spongy bone, the spongy bone on the outside of the long bone, at the edges of that hyaline cartilage, will then become compact bone. And then you will see the secondary ossification center emerging at the epiphyses of the long bone. And once the spongy bone is completed and some compact bone, right, to form the shell, is completed at the epiphyses as well, what you are left with is the epiphyseal plate, okay? And you will have an epiphyseal plate until you are about 25 years old, at which point it becomes the epiphyseal line and you don't grow anymore, right? So you don't get any taller once this cartilage turns into the epiphyseal plate. And then it's basically just a line of compact bone, really, through the ends of your long bones. I should find a picture, an actual real picture of that for you. A photo picture. Any questions about endochondral ossification? Epiphyseal line pick would be good to have. Okay. All right, so there it is again. This is the exact same thing that was at the beginning of this, our little walkthrough. Okay, so endochondral ossification, there it is, each step, and there it is again. Okay, so don't let that freak you out. The two different types of ossification. You don't need to know which parts go with which step. Just know the order that happens in. Okay, once that primary ossification is done, whether it be by intramembranous ossification of your flat bones or endochondral ossification of all of the rest of your bones, you end up continuing to grow and develop bone, right, for a long time. You have interstitial growth, which is what I was just talking about in terms of growth from the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so growth from the epiphyseal plates of your long bones is called interstitial growth. Okay, and then you also have appositional growth, which is growth that is basically changing the thickness of your bone, and yeah, that's pretty much it, changing the thickness of your bone. So it's bone remodeling. Okay, so it's either causing your bone to become thicker or causing your bone to become thinner, either by osteoblasts laying down bone matrix or osteoclasts pulling up bone matrix, resorbing bone matrix. Okay, all right. So that was two different types of ossification, right? Intramembranous and endochondral ossification, bone formation, okay? That's bone formation, right? So we're creating bone from scratch in both of those instances. When we're talking about interstitial and appositional growth, we're talking about altering bones that have already been ossified, okay? So the bone is there, we're just growing it, either in length in terms of long bone, or in thickness and in terms of all bones, okay? The length the length type of growth is called interstitial, and the thickness type of growth is called appositional. I hope that's clear. Let's talk about each of those. Interstitial growth, and there are steps to this. I'm gonna try and keep them as basic as possible, okay? So again, interstitial growth, we're changing the length of long bones by interstitial growth, okay? That happens at the epiphyseal plate. So it's at that line of cartilage that's separating the epiphyses from the diaphysis of long bones, okay? So it's like here-ish, okay? The epiphyseal plate. This was a grown-up rooster, judging by the spur. So this guy probably just has an epiphyseal line in there, but it'd be interesting to do a little section, make a little section, do my own mini little bone thing. I've got the tools to do this. We have the technology. I might just do that. All right, so growing from the epiphyseal plate cartilage means that we're starting from cartilage cells and stem cells, right? And we're going to be going through mitosis. Those cells are going to be dividing, right, in order to create more tissue, in order to grow the bone. Okay, so that epiphyseal plate, that line that is formed. I want a picture. I want a better picture than this. This is page 191 of your textbook. This epiphyseal plate that you are left with right here, it gets divided up into sections depending on where those dividing cells are, okay? So bear with me here. We've got a proliferation zone. We have a hypertrophic zone, a calcification zone, and an ossification zone. So let's look at what those might look like in real life, actually, which is kind of cool. Okay, so this is a microscopic image of the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so here's like a little chunk out of it, and we're looking at it now. And we're looking at the hyaline cartilage here at the, I guess you would just call it the epiphysis, more toward like the epiphyseal end, right? Up here is more cartilage. So hopefully you recognize that this is cartilage tissue here, hyaline cartilage in particular. So this should look like hyaline cartilage tissue, right? And as you go down towards the diaphysis, you're going to see more and more bone tissue. Okay, so this is going to be bone tissue right here. And so we're transitioning from hyaline cartilage to bone tissue, okay? And we do that in steps. The step 0, if you will, is the resting zone. So basically the center of the epiphyseal plate, this is kind of mirrored, okay? So basically you have the most cartilage in the middle of this line, right? And then you're going out to bone from either end, right? So this is like the middle of the epiphyseal plate, all along there, okay, is mostly cartilage. In the middle there, in the middle is resting zone, right? As we get towards bone, we have a proliferation zone. So the cartilage cells are dividing, okay? They're proliferating. This is cartilage cells, right? The hyaline cartilage of the epiphyseal plate is undergoing mitosis. It's dividing, it's proliferating. As those cells that have just divided get pushed down towards the bone, they reach the hypertrophic zone, which is where they kind of get larger, okay? So they kind of grow and get really big and fat. So that's the hypertrophic. Trophic is kind of like its consumption, right? It's like the different trophic levels in general biology, right? So hypertrophic, you might think of as like doing a lot of consuming, right? So they're getting really big and fat, okay? So these cartilage cells are getting big and fat. And then as they continue to be pushed down by the proliferation zone, they reach the calcification zone, which is where the matrix in and outside of the cells become calcified. So calcium is literally being deposited there, and it kills the cartilage cells. So the cartilage cells die. And then the matrix that was once the cartilage deteriorates, and then it becomes ossified. So then it becomes bone. So this is basically like sort of a drawn out description of the following basic sequence, okay? Resting zone is just sitting there resting. Proliferation zone, they're dividing. Hypertrophic zone, they're getting fat. Calcification zone, they're getting killed because calcium deposits are happening all around them. And then finally, they get replaced with bone tissue proper, with bone matrix, okay? That's all, that's as much detail as you need to know, okay? Know the 5 zones And by their names, really, you can kind of tell what's going on there. The cells are proliferating, cartilage cells are proliferating in the proliferation zone. They're getting fat in the hypertrophic zone. They're being surrounded by calcium in the calcification zone. And they're being replaced by bone in the ossification zone. Okay? So that's the first type of bone growth. That's interstitial bone growth. Okay? So again, here is interstitial bone growth. It's happening here at the epiphyseal plate, okay? Cartilage is being replaced by bone in the ossification zone, right? Which is along the edge here, right? The cartilage is replacing itself for as long as it needs to until you turn 25, when all this cartilage is gone and dead and this just becomes compact bone. And this turns into the epiphyseal line instead of the epiphyseal plate. What we're going to talk about next is bone remodeling, okay? So that's different from interstitial bone growth. It is, can't think of the name, appositional bone growth. Okay, sorry. Appositional growth is also known as bone remodeling. So again, here's our little epiphyseal plate, articular cartilage. The bone is, instead of growing longer, it is changing shape, okay? So in this example that they have here, we're showing some like degradation, maybe some aging of the bone here. So we've got bone being resorbed from the outside and from the inner wall of the compact bone of the diaphysis here. But it can go either way, okay? So bone remodeling can mean thickening of this wall, or it can be resorption of the bone tissue here. Either way, it's bone remodeling, it is appositional growth. And that appositional growth, the thickening or thinning, the osteoblasts building or osteoclasts destroying of bone tissue, is controlled at least partially by hormones, by your hormones, okay? So growth hormone, GH, you'll see, or HGH, human growth hormone, stimulates the epiphyseal plate activity. So that, we're talking about interstitial growth again, right? So interstitial growth, if we're talking about the epiphyseal plate, growth from the epiphyseal plate, we're talking about interstitial growth. So we're talking about the length of long bones. We're growing long bones longer. And that is controlled by human growth hormone. Okay, so that's gonna be what tells those cartilage, those hyaline cartilage cells to proliferate in the proliferation zone, right? And push down into the other three zones. Thyroid hormone also actually modulates the activity of growth hormone. So if you have a thyroid hormone imbalance, that is going to affect your growth hormone, okay? So that's kind of a cascading consequence of having problems with thyroid hormone. Sex hormones, testosterone and estrogens, at puberty, which is when they become super active, right? They promote your adolescent growth spurts, right? So remember when you would get like pains in your legs? Like I remember getting like, just having like achy leg bones because you're going through a growth spurt, right? You'd have that growing pains, like literal growing pains around puberty. So you'd have those growth spurts, that interstitial growth at the epiphyseal plate of your long bones. Yeah, that's basically what that is. So you've got testosterone, estrogen also causing growth spurts, right? So this is all having to do with interstitial growth, but hormones also affect appositional growth. So in terms of appositional growth, where you're thickening or thinning bone material that's already there, you're going to have bone being deposited where there is an injury or where extra strength is needed, okay? You are also going to, you're going to need certain things in order to promote bone deposit. Obviously, you're going to want calcium, but you're also going to want protein and vitamins C, D, and A. Since we're talking about calcium phosphate as the mineral that your bone matrix is made up of, the inorganic part of your bones is made up of, phosphorus is therefore also important in order to create calcium phosphate. And then you also need magnesium and manganese. So whatever, take your multivitamin and grow your bones, okay? Oops. Bone resorption. So again, still appositional bone growth, right? Your osteoclasts, in order for this to actually happen, what is actually happening here is that your osteoclasts are secreting enzymes, right? So proteins that do things, right? That are actually going to digest away the organic matrix, okay? And they produce acids, which the osteoclasts themselves are going to produce enzymes and acids that are going to digest the organic matrix and then convert that calcium, the calcium phosphate salt, into just calcium ions, phosphate ions, and other things that can be passed along and then used by the rest of your body. So remember somebody asked about if do osteoclasts transport the bone matrix to the rest of the body. This is an interesting touching upon of that. We've got the dissolved matrix that is dissolved by the stuff that the osteoclasts secreted, right? So enzymes and acids. Once it is dissolved, it is transcytosed. This is a past tense form of to transcytose, which is to transport through the cell, okay? So trans as in transporting, and cyto as in through the cell or through like the cytoplasm, okay? So you're basically moving that cytoplasm through the osteoclast itself, and then it's going to pass it along into the outside of the cell, into the interstitial fluid, right? The extracellular fluid, and then it's going to go into the bloodstream from there. So it's actually transported through the body by the blood, but the osteoclasts get it there by dissolving the matrix and then taking that calcium, moving it all the way through itself, and then tossing it out the back, basically, into the interstitial fluid, where it then eventually gets to the bloodstream. So pretty cool, right? So the reason why this bone remodeling happens is both having to do with hormones and having to do with actual like physical mechanical stressors. So the hormonal mechanisms that maintain your calcium homeostasis in the blood are obviously going to affect which way your bone remodeling is going to go, whether it's going to be more on the osteoblast side or the osteoclast side. And then mechanical and gravitational forces also are going to encourage bone growth in places where your body decides that it's needed. So blood calcium is going to determine whether or not we are going to need to take calcium out of your bones in order to maintain blood calcium homeostasis, or if we are going to have to deposit more calcium into the bone in order to maintain blood calcium homeostasis. Whether you have blood calcium homeostasis or not to begin with is controlled or is sensed or controlled by your hormones, right? So this is one of those feedback loops, right? So once your blood calcium level reaches a certain level, either too low or too high, it's going to trigger a feedback loop that's going to be hormonally mediated, right? So it's going to cause hormones to instruct your bone cells to either put down some more bone or take up some more bone in order to maintain your blood calcium homeostasis. The reason why we need calcium for things other than your bone and why we might need to resorb it out of your bone for other purposes is because it's needed for the transmission of nerve impulses. So again, those the action potential or that electrochemical signaling from cell to cell, most notably cell to cell as in neuron to neuron, right? So our entire nervous system depends on having calcium ions available. Oh, Did I just do that? Did I just accidentally scribble on the page? That's so weird. All right, anyway, don't mind me. Can I do it again? Nope, that was just some weird, can you see that? Sorry, that's freaking me out. All right, so nerve impulses needs calcium ions. Muscle contraction needs calcium ions, again, because of that electrochemical gradient that you're producing. Blood coagulation requires calcium. Secretion by glands and nerve cells requires calcium. And cell division itself requires calcium in varying degrees. So if you don't have enough calcium in your blood to do all of this stuff, then you're going to end up taking it out of your bones, which means activating your osteoclasts, right? Okay.
Are these technically deficiencies like vitamin D deficiency, vitamin C, all that?
So those types of deficiencies can result, what happened? Okay, can result in this not happening, right? So it can result in bone deposit not happening, or for your osteoblasts to basically not have what they need to do their job. Yeah. Let me just get I want to erase it. Like, how did I do that? That's so weird. Sorry if it's annoying. Sorry if it's as annoying to you as it is to me. It's very annoying to me. I have this little squiggle on my screen. I don't know if you can see it. Okay, so where were we? All right, so we need calcium for all these other things. If you don't have enough of it, your osteoclasts are going to be activated to pull it out of your bones. So here is that that feedback loop. Okay, so it's like this chain reaction that gets started by your blood calcium levels going down. So if your blood calcium levels go down below homeostasis, your parathyroid hormone is going to activate your osteoclasts to degrade your bone matrix and release the calcium. And then your blood calcium levels will then go up, okay? This is, you don't need to memorize this. Yeah, don't worry about this, as long as it makes sense. Does this make sense to you guys? Homeostasis was thrown out of whack. Your blood calcium level is too low. Your parathyroid hormone is what's going to be released from your parathyroid glands to tell your osteoclasts to pull calcium out of the bones to put into your blood so that your blood homeostasis returns to normal. Pretty straightforward, right? I think we're going to go into painful detail here in this graph. Just another way of looking at it. This is a kind of a throwback to that homeostasis maintenance or feedback loop image, that infographic that we had way back when we were first talking about like what it means to be alive and a living thing, right? So this is just basically the version for blood calcium homeostasis, okay, and how we maintain homeostasis through a feedback loop there. Okay, all right. This is the reverse. So if you have too much blood calcium, your homeostasis is also thrown off, right? Because it needs to stay within a certain level. If you have too much blood calcium level, you're going to have special cells releasing calcitonin, which is a hormone, which tells your osteoblast to deposit calcium into your bones, okay? Therefore, that calcium leaves your blood and goes into your bones, and your blood calcium levels go down and return to normal, and you're back in blood calcium homeostasis. Don't worry about these details. This, I think, is a protein. This is a hormone, certain type of cell. Don't worry about the details. Just beating a dead horse at this point. All right. Vitamin D affects your ability to absorb calcium, right? So if you don't have enough vitamin D, then you cannot effectively absorb calcium, which is another important reason to either go out and get some sunshine or take a vitamin D supplement, right? If you're an indoor kid, take a vitamin D supplement especially. So your vitamin D is made in the skin, hence needing the sunshine. It's also made in your liver and your kidneys. And it is essential in the cells of the lining of your gut to allow them to absorb calcium out of your food. So it doesn't matter how much calcium you're eating. It doesn't matter how much milk you're drinking or cheese you're eating or yogurt. If you don't have enough vitamin D, then you cannot absorb it as effectively. So that's why vitamin D is important. Okay, now this is really cool. This is the cool part here. So response to mechanical stress. I'm not going to get too crazy into this because we're running out of time. We have about an hour left here. So Wolff's law states that a bone grows or remodels in response to forces or demands placed on it, okay? So basically you have your bone, and if this rooster was like constantly like working out, like literally like taking a little like dumbbell in his claw and like lifting weights or something, which would be hilarious. I would love to see that, right? If he did that enough, then the muscles of his legs would be pulling on the bone in certain places, right? And if he was doing that lifting a lot, then he would be growing big fat muscles, right? He'd be getting swole, and then those muscles would be pulling more on the bones. So that mechanical stress, according to Wolff's law, will directly cause the bone to thicken in areas where it is receiving more of that stress from those bigger muscles that this little guy has been growing. How cool is that, right? So some observations, real life observations of Wolff's law include handedness, right? So if you're right-handed, then literally the bones of your right hand and arm are going to be like thicker and stronger than the bones of your non-dominant hand and arm. Curved bones are thickest where they are most likely to buckle. So this is an okay example, but like this is not a curved bone, so it's not really that great of an example. But like bones like the femur, where you have like a neck and that round ball right at the top of the femur that goes into your hip socket, that curve there, actually, that's my example. That curve right here it causes, since your body weight is actually sitting on the ball of your femur right there, as it sits inside the socket of your pelvis, the weight is going to be right here, right? So it's pushing down directly onto the head of the femur. It's going to be like trying to bend the neck of the femur right here, right? So those forces, that force is opposed by how thick the bone is right here, right? As the stress is being placed on the ball and the neck of the femur right here, you are actually going to have compression of the bone right here, right? So if you're trying to bend the neck and the ball of the femur like that right here, you're going to be kind of compressing the bone right there, right? And you're going to be sort of stretching or causing tension on the bone on the other side over here, right? And the bone can feel that. I don't understand how really, but the bone can feel that. And if there's compression here and tension here, then the bone will get thicker where it needs to in order to counteract the stressors, like the combined stress being placed on it by load bearing, by body weight, or if you start like lifting weights, or you start doing exercises like running, anything where you're building muscle mass in places where you didn't have it before, those bones have to get thicker in order to counteract the pull of those muscles and the actual physical weight of whatever it is that you're doing. The trabeculae forming along the lines of stress, we already talked about. And then of course, when we talk about bone markings, we're going to talk about bone projections, which are like sort of like maybe ridges, sort of like this one right here. Those actually become larger and more pronounced if they are places where muscles attach to bone, which a lot of those markings are. They're just places where the muscle attaches to the bone. That actual ridge or nodule or whatever has to actually get bigger for the muscle, for all of that muscle to attach to, and so that the muscle doesn't rip off of the bone. So really, really cool. Not just hormone.
Question.
Yeah, go for it. No, go for it.
Is this permanent growth? or is this just
Not necessarily, right? So bone remodeling goes in both directions. So as long as you're maintaining like physical exercise, if that's what if it's mechanical, or if it's dietary, or if it's hormonal, right? If you're maintaining a healthy diet and getting all of the building blocks you need in order to build bone, and if you're doing exercise, any kind of weight training, but really most types of exercise where there's any kind of resistance at all, you're going to be encouraging your osteoblasts to be working harder than your osteoclasts. So if you're not doing those things, if you're not getting enough of your vitamin D or your calcium, and you're not doing a lot of exercise, then it may be that your osteoclasts, end up getting the upper hand and you start tearing that bone back down.
and that's basically what Wolff's Law is, right? The fact that your bone has the capability to grow
Wolff's Law is
bigger.
specifically for the mechanical stress. So Wolff's Law is specifically in response to mechanical stress. So just for if you're doing weight training, or if you're exercising and you're causing stress on the bones that causes them to get bigger, that's Wolff's Law. So it doesn't apply to like the hormonal or the dietary vitamin deficiency stuff, just the mechanical stress.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. So Wolff's Law is super cool, and your bones are super awesome. So let's talk about when they are less awesome and they break, or when you think you're awesome and you do something stupid and you break your bones. So this part is pretty interesting, and this is the last bit. So we're pretty much done after this. So we'll talk about some bone diseases after this, but bone fractures, okay? There are 4 different general classifications of bone fractures, okay? So they can be either non-displaced or displaced, which basically means that the point of where it broke, and I don't want to break any of my bones, not like my actual physical bones, but you know what? I've got a crappy old toothbrush here that I bet I could break. I have to pick one of the really, really skinny ones though, or else I won't be able to break it. Here, this one doesn't even have a brush, so don't feel bad. This one's really crappy. Okay, so I'm gonna break that. Okay, so imagine the paintbrush is a bone, right? And you jumped off your roof on a dare and you broke your bone, okay? If it is non-displaced, then the 2 ends of the broken bone are basically where they should be, okay? So it's basically like the bone is broken, it's broken all the way through, but the bone hasn't like moved away from where it should be, right? If it's displaced, then it's gonna be like this, or like this, right? Like this, or like this. So basically the bone has been displaced from where it normally should be. The completeness of the break is whether or not it's broken all the way through. So this would be a complete break, or incomplete would be if it was still attached by something by a little bit like this, okay? So this would be an incomplete break, which means that it's well, actually, let's see that. So that would be an incomplete displaced break, right? This would be an incomplete non-displaced break if it was still attached at some point in there. This would be a complete non-displaced break, and this would be a complete displaced break. Okay, so those are 4 general types of breaks, classifications of breaks. Among those classifications, so once you've decided whether a bone break is displaced or non-displaced and complete or incomplete, it can have a different pattern. So you can describe a bone break by the pattern that the actual break took. A linear break would kind of be this. So you basically have a break that occurred along the long axis of the bone, right? So it's sort of like it's split. Yeah, so that would kind of be a linear break. A transverse break would be more like this, where it's like straight across down its short side this way, right? Versus this, where the break is lengthwise along it, okay? So a linear versus a transverse break. I don't know if you guys can even see any of this crap that I'm doing here. I'm sorry. I hope it's being helpful. And it can also be compound or simple. And a compound break, if you don't know, is when the bone end penetrates the skin, right? So really scary, nasty bleeding breaks where a chunk of where the bone is actually coming out of the skin. Or a simple break where the bone is not breaking through the skin, okay? So it can be displaced, non-displaced, complete or incomplete. And in addition, it can be linear or transverse. It can be compound or simple, okay?
Actually, I have a question.
Yep.
Are any of these fractures like difficult to see? Because the reason I'm asking is because I know my boyfriend told me when he was younger, he broke his hand and they couldn't find it in the x-ray, but like from his arm, he couldn't go past like a certain length. Like he couldn't stretch it out all the way. So he popped it back in place himself. So that's why I'm wondering, like, are any fractures like sometimes difficult to see?
Absolutely, yeah. So like there are hairline fractures, you know, so there are fractures where it's really more a crack than it is a proper fracture, and that would be really hard to see. But I could see how a non-displaced, incomplete fracture would probably be difficult to see, even on an X-ray. It could be if it's so non-displaced that it didn't even, like, it's hard to even see the crack. But if it's in like just the right place where, you know, like if the muscle was pulling, you know, and it was sort of like causing it to rub the two edges of the break to rub or something, where it would be too painful or you physically wouldn't be able to like extend or flex in a particular direction. Sure thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And, you know, because this is, it's infinite, you know, every inch of your bones that could possibly, where a break could possibly happen. You know, the combinations are pretty infinite. But this is just the basic language that, you know, that you're going to end up using as nurses or healthcare professionals to describe different kinds of breaks. So it can be non-displaced, it can be displaced, it can be complete or incomplete, it can be linear or transverse, and it can be compound or simple. And we also have some more specific types of breaks that are, there's some really good pictures of them on page 197 of your textbook. 197 and 198 has a nice chart showing the different types of breaks that we're going to talk about now. So these are described by their location, by their external appearance, and by the nature of the break. So let's see what those are. So, okay, so some specific types of breaks. A comminuted break is when the bone hasn't just broken into two pieces, but instead you have like some other chunks that also broke off in there, right? So a comminuted fracture is when you also have fragments of bone more than two pieces, basically, right? So the bone is broken into more than two pieces. A compression break is common for your vertebrae, and that is when, like, if you land terribly, or maybe you're in some sort of a car accident, and your vertebrae, the body of your vertebra gets crushed, that can be a compression break. You can also get a compression break in your skull, right? So there are, if you watch enough true crime, you've seen lots of ones where people are like bludgeoned, and then you end up with compression fractures in the bones of the skull. You can also have a spiral break, so literally a break that occurs from like twisting the bone around, and then the break actually appears like a spiral going like around the bone, right? From twisting forces, it's a common sports fracture, right? So you can break your own bones just by the combination of inertia and the strength of your own muscles, right? And a spiral break is an example of doing something like that. An epiphyseal break, you probably would be able to figure out on your own, is a break that occurs along the epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal plate, okay? So where the cartilage cells are, where the cartilage cells are dying, and the calcification, so at the calcification zone of your epiphyseal plate can be a little bit weaker. a little bit less strong, so it might be a little bit more prone to breaking right there. Okay, so an epiphyseal fracture happens along the epiphyseal plate. A depression, a depressed fracture. Oh, so I guess a compression fracture is specific for, maybe not necessarily. I guess it could be for any bone that is crushed, but there is a distinction between compression, or the crushing of a, I guess any bone in any, in porous bones. So if you have osteo, what am I trying to say? Osteoporosis, oh wow. Yeah, I'm losing it, guys. This is a long lecture. But if you have porous bones, then you can get a compression fracture more easily. But specifically to the skull, when I was saying that like bludgeoning deaths or terrible skull head injuries or things like that, is technically has a specific term, and it is a depressed fracture. So skull fractures are termed depressed fractures, which is different than compression fractures, which is where you are actually compressing a bone from two edges and like sort of crushing it, okay? A greenstick fracture is when you break a bone incompletely, okay? So basically, I don't know if I can even do this. They call it greenstick because like green living tree branches, right? It's really hard to break them cleanly. They don't snap really easily. Instead, they might like just sort of split at a point. So young bones that are still like kind of flexible might see a greenstick fracture where only one side of the bone actually breaks. So that would be an incomplete, non-displaced, simple fracture, right? Everything that we've seen here, all these examples are simple, not compound, right? Non-displaced. This would be a transverse, right? Was it transverse? Yep, a transverse break here. We've got kind of a linear-ish break happening here. We've got a little bit of displacement going on with this, with the fibula in particular over here. This is majorly displaced. This would even be compound probably, right? So that sharp edge of bone probably would penetrate the skin. This one might have been compound, hopefully not. Actually, probably not, since it's on the medial edge of the tibia here, but this would be also displaced. And then again, non-displaced. And those terms are kind of irrelevant for skull bones, right? So I guess you could refer to that as being somewhat displaced in terms of where those bones are supposed to be, right? And these are all complete except for the greenstick, right? Those are all complete versus incomplete fractures. Okay, so let's go through the basic steps of how we heal bone fractures. The first step is that we form a hematoma. A hematoma is basically a blood clot. Okay, so we're basically just, the blood is coming to the site of injury to invade it with cells that are involved in healing, and also to like physically protect it, so a blood clot. Okay, the site is going to be swollen, painful, and inflamed. It is an inflammatory phase, not unlike that of the epidermis, right? Or dermis, deeper superficial wounds of the skin, right? You're going to have an inflammatory phase to start with. So that hematoma is forming as part of the inflammatory phase, is swollen and painful. So here's our blood clot forming in and around the site of the fracture. Okay, so blood is basically sort of like pooling in here. This is underneath the periosteum, as you can see. Right? So all the blood supply like of the bone itself is all leaking into this fracture, and you're going to end up with a bunch of blood that's going to end up clotting. You're going to have a callus then forming at the site of the fracture. It's going to be made of fibrocartilage. Okay, so it's a fibrocartilaginous callus. So basically you're going to have the cells from the blood, including phagocytic cells, are going to clear debris and pathogens if it was a compound fracture, right? out of the injured area. Osteoblasts are going to start their work, and you're going to be forming this cartilaginous callus while this is happening. Okay, so the most important part of step 2 is that you're forming a fibrocartilaginous callus. Don't worry about the details of it so much, but you're basically going to be laying down fibrocartilage everywhere where that hematoma was. Okay, so you're basically this is like for protection and for stabilization, right? You're really trying to stabilize this break. The blood vessels will start, growing again, and the bone will start growing again too, right? Out of this fibrocartilage. The third stage is the bony callus forming. Okay, so you've gone from having blood filling that injury site to cartilage filling the injury site. And now finally you're starting to form a bony callus. Okay, so basically you're just going to be slapping down bone tissue on here trying to heal this. Okay, so you're forming new trabeculae, spongy bone, and it's going to go on for like 2 months where you're going to be making this sort of ugly, it doesn't really matter, just get bone tissue going in there like as soon as possible callus happening here. Okay, once the bone is all stabilized and you have that callus there, you're going to go back, the bone is going to go back and remodel itself to make it pretty again, right? To make it as close as possible to what it once was. So you're going to start experiencing mechanical stress at that site of injury, right? And so you're just going to have normal bone remodeling happening at that site. But it's probably going to be happening a little bit more at that site just based on changes that have happened since that injury and due to that injury. So ideally, the final structure is going to resemble the original or what it was before. So the healed fracture hopefully will look a lot like what it was before it got fractured, right? And that's through bone remodeling. So you're going to take some of the extra out. You're going to lay down compact bone, right? You're going to try and make this look more like the normal rest of the bone as possible. Mm-hmm. And you're going to see some of that in x-rays or like in a skeleton, right? Like if they dig up a skeleton, they can see if there were broken bones or not because it never is exactly like the original. So here are all 4 of those steps. Hematoma to a fibrocartilaginous callus, to a bony callus, and then some bone remodeling to make it pretty. Okay, any questions about that? Or the bone fractures? Bone fractures are how to heal them. Doing good? I'm surprised that you guys are all still with me. This is great. It's gonna be a long video. All right, so let's talk about some bone diseases and then we'll call it, okay? So we've got, I think, there are 3 different diseases we're going to talk about. Osteomalacia and rickets are similar, except that rickets only happens in little kids. Okay, so osteomalacia is like the grown-up version of rickets. But in both cases, the calcium is not being, the calcium-rich bony matrix, the actual hard part of your bone, is not being deposited evenly throughout the bone where it's supposed to be. So you're going to end up having very porous bones, but more porous in some places than in other places. So you're going to have, if it happens during childhood, if it's rickets, then you're going to end up having permanent bone deformities, like bowed legs is a common reaction to rickets as a child. And the reason why people have osteomalacia and rickets is because of this vitamin D deficiency. So if you don't have vitamin D or enough calcium, if you don't have enough calcium and or you don't have enough vitamin D in order to absorb that calcium, then you're not going to be able to deposit it into your bones evenly or at all. So you're going to end up with osteomalacia if you're older, or rickets if you're a little kid. And if you're a little kid and you get rickets, then you might end up with a permanent lifelong bone deformity because you're trying to grow at that time, right? Right. All right. And then when you're older, you can get osteoporosis, which is the word that I was trying to say before that I forgot. osteoporosis is not that hard to remember. We've all heard the term before, but it's loss of bone mass due to old age. So basically osteoclasts are working harder than osteoblasts, okay? Bone resorption is outpacing bone deposit. So the spongy bone of the spine and neck of the femur, from that picture that we were looking at before with the stress, right? That Wolff's Law thing. They become very, very susceptible to fracture. So the neck and the ball of the femur can be susceptible to fracture, which is why older people are always breaking their hips, right? So if they're not doing their exercises, if they're not getting up and walking around or swimming or doing some sort of like resistance-based exercise, then you're going to be more susceptible to breaking your bones. And that's a particular place where you have a lot of stress, there's a lot of weight load happening there. And if you aren't getting your bone being deposited there, or if you've got bone being resorbed there, then you're going to have a problem. The reasons why osteoporosis happen is in women, mostly, once you stop menstruating, right, you're going to end up losing out on that estrogen that your ovaries produced. And that lack of estrogen, that hormone, is going to actually stop telling your bone osteoblasts to deposit bone tissue, right? If you, again, have a low level of calcium or vitamin D and you're older, that's going to exacerbate osteoporosis. If you are smaller, for some reason, you are more prone to osteoporosis. So take your vitamins and do your exercise. If you sit around a lot, osteoporosis. If you have low levels of, which one is this? Thyroid something hormone? Call it out if you know it, because I don't. Thyroid, I already forgot. It's not there. It's not there, whatever. This hormone, low levels of certain hormones can cause a risk of osteoporosis. And diabetes mellitus can also be a risk factor for osteoporosis for probably complex reasons that I do not know. So here's a picture, an actual real picture of what the trabeculae of normal bone should look like. And here's an actual picture of what the trabeculae of bone with osteoporosis looks like. So it's just sort of like getting holy, just sort of getting holy in there, right? Getting more porous, more pores, okay? In order to prevent osteoporosis, then you want to do the opposite of the risk factors, right? So you want to supplement with calcium and vitamin D. Fluoride, I guess, helps, but that's in our tap water. So do more weight-bearing exercises. Don't sit around, especially as you get older. When you go through blanking on the word. When you stop menstruating as a female, you run out of eggs.
Menopause?
Menopause?
Thank you.
Menopause.
Thank you. Oh my God. Okay. So going through menopause means that you run out of eggs and you're no longer producing estrogen out of your ovaries. So if you lose that estrogen, you can do estrogen replacement, hormone replacement therapy with synthetic or sometimes like horse estrogen and weird things like that, but hopefully synthetic estrogen in order to slow down that bone loss. You can actually slow down osteoporosis if you're menopausal by doing hormone replacement therapy. And there are drugs that will help you to regain bone mass. So statins, Fosamax, I guess, is one. And SCRMs also help to increase your bone mineral density. So there are like pharmaceutical ways to also try and combat it, but you know, start with diet and exercise always. Oh, there's that sneaky last disease that I knew was in here, Paget's disease. So Paget's disease is when you have haphazard bone formation. So basically you've got really porous bone in some places and then really thick bone in other places. It usually happens in specific bone groups. So if you have Paget's disease, it's usually like, oh, I have Paget's disease in my pelvis, or I have Paget's disease of the spine, or in my femur or in the skull. It's not throughout the whole body for some reason. It's just sort of localized. So you have a really high ratio of spongy to compact bone. So lots and lots of spongy bone and not as much compact bone, and reduced mineralization, right? So less of that inorganic bone material, the calcification. We don't know what causes Paget disease, and it can affect anyone at any age. So there are treatments for Paget's, supplementation of calcitonin and biphosphonates can help to treat Paget's disease, and we don't know why it's caused. So that was 4 different diseases, right? We had rickets, we had osteomalacia and rickets, right? For grown-ups, for kids. Osteoporosis, generally when you're older. But also, like, what if you have to have a hysterectomy, right? Then you probably want to do hormone replacement therapy anyway, just to avoid osteoporosis. Anyway, last one, Paget's disease, okay? Haphazard bone formation happens locally in a certain bone group usually. This is kind of more just sort of FYI for your information. I'm not going to test you on this. Just kind of interesting kind of stuff. The embryo, an embryo can be aged pretty specifically from x-rays or sonograms because the skeleton ossifies predictably. So depending on how much bone there is in the embryo, you can tell how old it is. Kind of cool. By the time a fetus is born and becomes not a fetus, but a baby, the long bones are usually bone. They're ossified. A lot of the other bones are still cartilage. So here's all the bones of a fetus, right? All the little long bones look like they're pretty much ossified, right? So the ossified ones look more orangey. So it takes until age 25 for your bones to be completely ossified, right? So by the time that epiphyseal plate turns into an epiphyseal line, you're probably 25. And then by the 4th decade, so into your 40s, you you've peaked, you know, and you start to go down a little bit in terms of bone mass. So that's when you really got to start worrying about doing your exercises and taking your vitamins and minerals. Your rate of bone loss is determined not just by the environmental factors, but also by genetics. So you don't know if you don't know where you stand and your family history has a history of bone loss, then even more so reason to exercise and get your vitamins and minerals. In old age, bone resorption predominates. Indeed, it does. All right, you guys. So we talked about microscopic bone tissue. We saw some examples. Your Wiley Plus has some other cool stuff. For bone stuff, we've got an interactivity that I also linked into Canvas. But basically it just kind of like lets you see some more examples of bony versus compact bone tissue, where the connective tissue is around it, right? So regular dense connective tissue is like your ligaments and tendons, right? So attaching bone to bone, attaching bone to muscle, your hyaline cartilage, your fibrocartilage. So if you want to check that out, I have linked it in Canvas, and I will link the YouTube video in Canvas somewhere around right here. And then I also linked the tissue. So that was that bone structure and tissue one, but the Lee's histology bone tissue, just because I think it's so cool, you know, so you can go and like explore around this weird alien planet that is crushed bone tissue. All right, and then on Thursday, we're going to talk about, we're going to start talking about bones, and we're going to start with the axial skeleton. So that's your skull, your spinal cord, and your thoracic cage, right? So we'll start talking about that on Thursday. And on Thursday, we'll start with lab 11, right? Which is when we're going to start talking about bone markings. So you'll be able to start on lab 11 by then. Obviously, if you want to start that early, have at it. Your textbook is excellent, and there's no reason why you can't figure most of this out without me, honestly. So if you want to scoot on over to chapter 7 and start looking at this, then have at it. Be my guest. You'll just be ahead. And then this week's quiz, we're going to be, we'll quiz on the bone tissue stuff, not the axial skeleton stuff. So, but more on that later. I'm going to make an announcement about the fall class section that you guys, I hope.
I have a question about the lab before you get into that announcement.
Go for it.
How do you want us to approach these labs, since I know they're hands-on? Like, what do you recommend we do since we physically don't have those structures?
Yeah. So this is going to be, it's going to be tough, but it's going to be up to you guys, depending on how you learn, again, right? So if it helps you to draw pictures, draw a bunch of pictures. I'm going to be giving you a lot of pictures with examples of these guys. I'm going to try and see if I can't get my hands on some bone models to show you guys visually, just here on video. The stuff where it's like, do with a partner, do it in a mirror or with yourself. So that page 47 is actually, so pages 47 through 49, which are actually part of, at the very end, at lab 16, we're going to be kind of going through lab 11 through 16, sort of like all sort of mixed up and at the same time. I'll try and keep it as separate as possible, but it's basically all of the names of the bones and all of the markings on each bone. But 47, 48, and 49, these questions where it's like asking you to like move, abduct your arm and stuff like that. It's important to try and do that stuff, like physically do it to help you to learn. Like, why are you limited in hyperextension of the forearm? Like, there are some really important like conceptual stuff. So make sure that you do those questions. But for the rest of it, it's going to be a matter of whether or not it's easier for you to write out a description or draw a picture or print out a picture from the internet and label. That would help, if that would help you as well. Collecting various resources from around the internet that have these things. I have a really actually kind of cool little thing that I found for you guys. Body Smart is pretty nifty. So it's a little bit basic, but it's pretty awesome just in terms of identifying the bones themselves. I'll have to find some more stuff in terms of markings, unless it has it. Does it have? Oh, it does. Oh, it's so cool. Okay, so never mind. So this Body Smart website I have linked on Canvas is actually really cool because it does show you the markings of the bones. So like here's the humerus and it's telling you there's the head. And then you get to quiz yourself too. So the greater tubercle. So you get an idea of like where these different markings are on the bones. So that's pretty cool. I'm actually even more impressed with that than I
have a quick question about the lab.
Yeah.
So for like pages 47, 40, and 49, the ones where you have to like use a partner, can I just use like a family member?
Absolutely. Yes. Anything that'll help you to engage your brain and actually do it. I'm actually gonna I'm thinking I'm just gonna like take it off of screen share and like we're just gonna like dance around and learn all the different motions and stuff. Either for whether or not we do that for joints or we do it for, I think we might do that in muscles. So when we get to, when we get to muscles, so when we get to page 50, we're gonna start talking about the terminology for flex and extend and all these different things. We're gonna dance around, we're gonna be moving around a little bit. So yeah, whatever helps you, you know. In terms of like what to turn in, there isn't a whole lot that I can say about that because there aren't a lot of like actual questions. Just send me a picture of whatever you're doing to study, I guess, you know. It's like if you're doing flashcards, then like I don't know, send me a picture of your flashcards, or send me a screenshot of, you know, whatever you're using to study, since there aren't any questions for you really to answer or anything for you to write down. So it's pretty free form. I hate to not be able to give you guys more structure than that, but because this lab manual is the way that it is, there really isn't that much more for me to do, unless I were to, like, I guess I could like design the assignment or something, but without having the bones in front of you. I know we have the we have a real anatomy skeleton. So we can always be like, you know, rotate this guy around and identify the bones and zoom in and out and stuff. Like, so this guy is really cool too. I have this guy linked as well in your Canvas. So this guy is pretty cool. I don't know how much.
If you put the practical exam, like it's cool because they like kind of asks you questions.
Yeah, so yeah, I forgot to like tell you guys about this. The first time I introduced this, I forgot I was going to tell you guys that there's a practical exam and a self-assessment option here. This is the Wiley Plus. So anytime that you want to quiz yourself on any of this, you literally can just tell it how many questions you want, if it's going to be timed or not. So you could like however hard you want it to be, and then whichever topics that you want to be quizzed on. So skull landmarks, like what you got? What's just one? Oh, it's like, I don't know what you want. I want 5 questions. Can you do that? No questions matching your criteria. Oh, why do you even have it there then? Stupid. All right, try this. All the landmarks. Can you do any of the landmarks? Oh, sweet. Okay. So yeah, so that's really cool. So you can quiz yourself on this stuff however you want. I guess you can't like move that around, but yeah. So that's pretty sweet. I don't know what the difference is between practical exam and self-assessment. I think it's the same thing. Looks like the same thing. So yeah, so you can quiz yourself on like really any of this stuff, which is pretty cool. And since we're going to be, or if you want to continue with this style next semester, even if we're in person, I don't think I'm gonna have you guys buy textbooks. I think I'm gonna have you guys buy Wiley Plus instead, so that you have this. And then you'll have a digital textbook as well anyway. So they're saying it'll be like $70, which is pretty awesome compared to buying physical textbooks, if you ask me. So excited about that, thinking way ahead, sorry. But this is going to be really cool. I was just looking at this and being like, oh, look at like the nervous, the endocrine, cardiovascular system, like all the stuff we're going to be talking about in the fall is here too. So,
Professor, really quick, I'm sorry. I just want to confirm all that's due this week is the quiz that we have on Friday, from Friday to Sunday, and Lab 10, correct? That's due today.
Lab 10. Is it due today? Today's the 7th? It's due on the 7th. I guess today is the 7th. I don't know what freaking day it is. Sorry. Yeah.
It's okay. I just wanted to make sure. And then all you want us to review is chapter 6, and then we're going to start chapter 7 on Thursday.
Exactly.
And then for next week, all we're going to be doing
next week
break is basically like review.
Yeah, really, yeah, absolutely. So Thursday is gonna be, it'll be pretty heavy if we do like bone markings as well. It won't be as heavy as today, I don't think, but I'd like to try and get through as much of bone markings as I can on Thursday, because it's gonna be the big sticking point in terms of like you guys in memorization. So I think spring break will be a really good time for you guys to like figure out how you're gonna study bone stuff, get that all together, you know, like make your flashcards or gather your pictures or print out your, you know, things you want to label or make your drawings, do all of that stuff and ask me whatever questions you want to ask me. while you're doing that, you know, and then we'll have a quiz, and it'll be, the quiz I think will open early on in the week and go all week long. So you'll have the whole week to do quiz 7, which will be on the axial skeleton. So you guys will have plenty of time to ask me any questions you have about that, or any of it before we do appendicular skeleton, which is relatively simple if you ask me, when we get back. And
Are
then
we still on track then to take the exam April 30th, exam 3?
Yep, we're on track. We are on track. Yeah.
Okay.
So since we weren't told anything about what was going to happen with spring break initially, a lot of the faculty did like what we did, which was like push and just like try and stay on track as much as possible. So it's kind of nice because we're kind of still getting a spring break. You know, I don't know if that's what you wanted, but we're on track according to for the way that the syllabus is and where we're headed. We are on track, and that's thanks to you guys' like incredible hard work on histology and integument. And I have to commend you guys. The scores on the exam were really good. I know that you had your books in front of you and everything, but still, I really feel like you guys were honest with yourselves, because the scores weren't like ridiculously high. It's not like straight A's or anything, but it's like, I think the average is going to end up being like high 70s to low 80s, which is like awesome. It's awesome. I'm just like so proud of you guys. You're doing it. We're doing it. It's happening. So I'm gonna wrap up here, stop the recording. We're gonna take a break, and then I'll just come back at 5:30 in case you guys have questions about today's lecture. And so I'll just be here, and I'll record it and post it if anybody shows up and asks some questions. Okay.
I just had one more random question about one of the diseases, osteomalacia and rickets.
Yeah.
Because you said rickets is like for children,
Yeah.
and osteomalacia is like the adult version. So is that kind of like chickenpox and like shingles?
Wow, that's a really, really interesting like metaphor, like medical metaphor. I wonder. I honestly don't know, but that's super interesting.
I was just wondering because I know chickenpox is like the kid version of shingles.
Yeah, no, it literally is. I don't know. So because these guys are they're caused by a particular deficiency, and chickenpox and rickets are viral, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably the big reason, I think. I think these are just named different things. It must just be because if you have it as a kid, or they've been calling it rickets, right? Like since forever, right? It's like an old timey term for like kids that like have bone deformities because they didn't get enough calcium. It's not really a thing that we see in first world countries, at least anymore. But I think it's probably just like what we've always called it when kids end up end up bow-legged or having other skeletal deformities because of a deficiency. Whereas smallpox, chickenpox and shingles are virally related. Yeah, I didn't eat. I don't think I've eaten yet today. I think that's part of my problem. I should probably go eat something. But yeah, thank you for helping me throughout, you guys. This is a good lecture though. Anyway, long but good. So are there any other questions before we wrap? And then I'll come back and I'll be back at 5:30 at the other link, right?
What was your announcement?
Oh, it was just that the exams were really, really good, and I was really proud, and I'm really proud of you guys, and we're on track, and I'm gonna have your guys' exams graded by tonight.
Oh, I thought I had to do something with your other section for the fall.
The fall section one, no, I think I've said everything that I'm gonna say about that. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Just, I think we'll end up using Wiley Plus, and I'll post the section number in an announcement. That's what I was gonna say. I'm gonna post an announcement on Canvas, and I'll say the section number and the times of it to see if it's something that you guys can do, if you guys want to do it. So that's it. That's all.
Did they tell you by any chance, like, if you're gonna be like on a Tuesday, Thursday type of class, like on the fall?
It's Tuesday, Thursday, like 5. It's like 5 to 6, and then 6:30 to like 9:40.
We're back to late classes.
Yeah, it's a nighttime class. Yeah, it's like bio. Yeah. But at least there isn't that big of a gap in between. It's not like a full-on hour gap. And assuming that we're back to face-to-face instruction, which we are assuming because we wouldn't be teaching the class if it wasn't face-to-face, then that'll be nice. At least, if you're on campus, you're not going to be sitting around for an hour in between lecture and lab. And the lecture is before lab, so that's nice too. I'm gonna enjoy that more than the around. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Anything else?
Good. Thank you, Ashley.
No problem, you guys. I'll be back at 5:30 at the other link, at the lecture link. And otherwise, if I don't see you then, I'll see you on Thursday or hear you or whatever. Okay. So let's see if we
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night.